That's not very inclusive. No membrane-bound organelles? No entry. Here is 2.10, Origins of Cell Compartmentalization. Note disclaimer.
In this video, we're going to talk about the endosymbiotic theory. The endosymbiotic theory is the reason why we now know the differences between prokaryotes and eukaryotes. So let's talk about it. So when we talk about prokaryotes, we think of them as more simplistic. Because they're simplistic in structure, for example, they do not have membrane-bound organelles, we believe that they evolved 4 billion years ago, meaning that they were around 4 billion years ago. And then what ended up happening was at some point eukaryotes had emerged approximately 1.8 billion years ago. While the times are not specific for AP biology, it's important to note that you could see in the time frames that eukaryotes basically are more complex and they came in later in time. And this is what we grasp as scientists as the endosymbiotic theory, which is more important than the time frames. It's more about this idea that eukaryotic cells had once upon a time evolved from prokaryotic cells. So while prokaryotic cells are considered simplistic because they don't have membrane-bound organelles, like they don't have the mitochondria or the endoplasmic reticulum, these internal regions that are specialized must have evolved, at least we think, based on the endosymbiotic theory. To get into more details of the endosymbiotic theory or endosymbiosis, I want you to think about engulfing. And I want you to think about phagocytosis that we talked about in the earlier section. Remember, phagocytosis is a process in which you have a cell, and that cell will engulf an organelle. And I want you to remember when we're talking about the endosymbiotic theory, phagocytosis for just a second. So, what was believed to be was there was a period of time where there were cells that lived in a world with no oxygen. So, there was no O2 that was there. And during that time, it was more simplistic and more basic of cells, which we now considered prokaryotes. Then, what happened over a period of time, the world had what we now have considered to be oxygen. And during that time, we believe that there was mitochondria that had evolved from prokaryotes. Now, while you don't know the specifics about cellular respiration and mitochondria, you do remember mitochondria is considered the powerhouse of the cell. And in earlier sections related to Unit 2, we learned that mitochondria has its own DNA, which further clarifies this theory. So what happened, or what was believed to happen, is that there were mitochondria that were able to sustain the environment of O2. And because of this, through what we now consider phagocytosis, there was an engulfment behavior of this prokaryote turned into mitochondria, into a cell, which we now consider to be eukaryotes. At some later point, there was a theory that the photosynthetic prokaryotes later also became chloroplasts, which is why we have chloroplasts and mitochondria in other cells. The purpose of this is to understand that ATP comes from mitochondria and glucose comes from chloroplasts, which further clarifies this endosymbiotic theory. You'll notice that the chloroplasts and the mitochondria are very much evolved compared to the other organelles. For example, they have their own DNA and they have their own ribosomes, unlike other internal structures. And they tend to self-replicate independently, while mitochondria independently and chloroplasts self-replicate, which further holds the theory to be true because they're their own organelles and they're not dependent on other parts of the cell as much, I should say. So mitochondria and plastids or chloroplasts have their own DNA, which resemble the behavior of prokaryotes. The division of these organelles tend to mirror bacteria, and these structures feature double membranes. Remember, they have cristae, and if you remember, there's an outer and inner membrane in chloroplasts, and it's reminiscent of free living cells, as if they could be on their own. So this is evidence for the endosymbiotic theory as to why we believe it to be true. When we talk about the relationship, we think that over time, the chloroplasts and mitochondria, which which had evolved from once a prokaryote, was engulfed and then became endosymbiotic, which means that if you notice in the word endosymbiotic, you see the word symbiotic or symbiosis, which pertains to the relationship of these organelles. Chloroplasts and mitochondria need the cell as much as the cell needs chloroplasts and mitochondria. So the origin is said to be for mitochondria aerobic bacteria and chloroplasts photosynthetic bacteria. So basically, at one point, they were both prokaryotes and needed to evolve. And then once they were involved, they were engulfed by other cells.
Get back here, powerhouse! We've got energy to make!
Now let's talk about the differences between prokaryotes and eukaryotes by visualizing this Venn diagram, which also covers the similarities and differences between prokaryotes and eukaryotes as we note now. Firstly, with prokaryotes, remember these lack membrane-bound compartments, which means there's no true nucleus. Instead, DNA is tending to focus in a region called the nucleoid region. And this also means that they're smaller in size because they don't need to have these membrane-bound organelles like you see in eukaryotes. Remember, in the nucleus contains the DNA, and inside the nucleus it's very complex. They have their own linear DNA when it comes to eukaryotes, surrounded by histones. If you remember earlier in Unit 2, we talked about surface area and how surface area is really important when it comes to eukaryotes and the comparison between surface area and volume. In fact, we said surface area over volume was a formula in of itself in earlier parts of Unit 2. And that's because we had key organelles that are inside eukaryotes that you don't see in prokaryotes. And that is a reason why eukaryotes are larger in size as compared to prokaryotes, which are smaller in size. Now, with prokaryotes, they divide in a process called binary fission. In fact, it just means that the one splits into two. And because this is so simple, it tends to frequent a lot. So, meaning that binary fission is very quick and it produces a lot. This is why you see things like bacteria grows a lot and fast, and that's because prokaryotes, a specific type is bacteria or archaea, which are very simple in structure. They're actually very similar in structure, meaning if you take a look at a stack of bacteria of the same kind and look at another stack of bacteria of the same kind, you won't see much variety between them. And that's because they grow really fast through binary fission and they grow really quickly with the same pattern. However, when it comes to eukaryotes, they divide with a process called mitosis or meiosis, which you'll learn in a later unit. And this means they're more complex or specialized. So eukaryotes don't really divide as quickly. Examples of this include plants and animal, fungus, and protists. Things to note if they give you an AP biology question, sometimes they'll ask you to compare the differences between plants and animal cells. And if you remember, cell wall is important because that is contained in plants, whereas in animal cells, you do not have a cell wall. Now, they'll ask you this as a comparison between prokaryotes and eukaryotes. And now that you know that prokaryotes only include bacteria and archaea and not plants and animals, you'll now know the difference between prokaryotes and eukaryotes, understanding that plants and animal cells fall under the category of eukaryotes. Now, let's take a look at the similarities. They both have plasma membrane, they both contain ribosomes and are in a fluid-filled location called the cytoplasm. They have their own DNA and genetic material. The only difference is that DNA in prokaryotes is just in a region called the nucleoid, while in the nucleus is going to be the DNA for eukaryotes. They both reproduce and respond to the environment, but very quickly for prokaryotes, while we know for eukaryotes it can be a tad bit slower and a little bit more complex with processes called mitosis or meiosis. All together, they both work together to maintain a sense of homeostasis through metabolism and growth. Now, while you understand this, you'll also notice that I just finished talking about the similarities and differences, and this is a different Venn diagram to display it, and it shows the benefits of why it matters. So for prokaryotes, they store material, they have proteins, they photosynthesize and reproduce to survive. And then whereas in eukaryotes, they're going to prevent interference, they have cell efficiency, they have ideal reactions and conditions that are beneficial for it. So that's the difference between the two. So both Venn diagrams talk about the same thing. They're just talking about the pros and cons between both. Now let's tackle a quiz question together to try to see if we can understand the similarities and differences. Take a moment, pause this video, and unpause once completed. Okay, so this question basically says, which of the following best supports the endosymbiotic theory? Did you figure out the correct answer? If you selected A, you got the correct answer. The thing is, mitochondria and plastids have circular DNA, and while eukaryotes have membrane-bound organelles, the thing is, this isn't supporting the endosymbiotic theory. Same thing with prokaryotes lacking membrane-bound organelles. It's not the best support of the endosymbiotic theory because we have the mitochondria and plastids, which we talked about mitochondria and chloroplasts as evolution and evidence for evolution in this slide. We now know that's the best support because we have mitochondria and plastids, which basically states that at some point we had a cell. That cell was leaning towards prokaryotes. It engulfed the mitochondria and the chloroplasts, which then became eukaryotes, which basically supports the endosymbiotic theory better than B and C's answer choice. Also, it says eukaryotes have a nucleus for answer choice D. This isn't a great answer because it doesn't support the endosymbiotic theory, and we noted that the endosymbiotic theory has that word symbiosis in there, which basically states that the mitochondria and the plastids are dependent upon, in eukaryotes, the cell and vice versa. So we know that to be true, and also because they have their own DNA, which also leads us to believe that mitochondria and plastids once were on their own and they were able to survive on their own before being engulfed. And that was an evidence theory. So this is a question where all of the answer choices are true. So meaning eukaryotes do have a nucleus, prokaryotes lack membrane-bound organelles, eukaryotes have membrane-bound organelles, but A is the best choice for the question that you see here.
Appreciate you riding along for our cosmic journey. If today's mission brought you the knowledge that slaps, make sure to hit that like button to boost that signal. Subscribe if you're locked in for our next launch. And don't miss the link tree. It's got all the goods for AP Bio, PSAT Math, and SAT Math. Before I sign out, make sure you're all in one orbit and diving in. Killing out. Till next time.